in a digital age, data is critically
Mm,
important. It could be satellite data. I mean, it
mm,
could, it could military data, all sorts of data, critically important. And the polarization geopolitically is almost certainly going to take at least nation states, if not major enterprises,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
to a level where they say, okay, we need more control over
Mm,
this, right?
mm.
It's in our national interest to have more control over this.
Welcome to Inside Cybersecurity with Silake. My name is René Bonvanie, and I'm responsible for marketing at Silake. Today, I'm joined by Mark McLaughlin. In 2011, Mark became the CEO of Palo Alto Networks and was in that role for 7 years. He then served on the board for another 5 years. In that same period, he also served on the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, or NSTAC, a whole mouthful, including terms as chair and vice chair. He currently serves as chairman of the board of Qualcomm. In this episode, we're talking with Mark about the importance of cybersecurity at the board level, as well as why cyber sovereignty and resilience are increasingly important for organizations when it comes to cyber. So, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure.
Wonderful. Can you give us a quick overview of your career and how you got into cyber?
Yes. Well, most of it has been fortunate to work with great people like yourself who've made me look good. Thank you. That I got into cyber. My first real kind of cyber-oriented position was at VeriSign. I had the opportunity to run VeriSign, which ran all the DNS infrastructure, still does.
Mm,
And even though cyber was evolving early at that time, being that close to the intersection of the infrastructure for everything on the internet, we saw some of the earliest cyber problems as
mm.
well as the opportunities with that. And then it also, I think, made it in sort of a natural for me to come to Palo Alto Networks when Jim and Cheem and you and Nir gave me the opportunity to do that.
You've spent a significant amount of time as a CEO of what eventually became the largest cybersecurity company in the world, but a lot has changed, right? Since 2011, when you joined, and even earlier, right, as you said, from your days at VeriSign. What are some of those things that have changed, right, and have gotten you to rethink right, cybersecurity?
So much has changed. I try to think of things in terms of, or talking with people about it in tectonic shifts.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, tectonic technology shifts. So cyber, as we spend so much time,
Mm,
at Palo Alto Networks, talking about I think is fabric, right? And through society. So it's a constant. It's there. There's pros, there's cons, there's
mm,
good guys, there's bad guys, but it's fabric and it's woven all through of everything we do in a digital society. So with that in mind as a constant, then what would change, right?
mm.
And there's tectonic technology shifts that come along about every 10 years, sometimes little shorter compression timeframes, and they provide opportunities for cyber to be a problem again or to be
Yep,
helpful, right? In this
yep.
cat and mouse game, like mobility, SaaS, cloud, right? And now AI, of course,
Mm,
right? So every time one of these tectonic shifts occurs, what usually happens is cyber grows as far as a problem to be solved, so the addressable market opportunity grows,
mm.
and then an enormous amount of the dollars spent moves around a lot
Yeah,
in who is going to be able to capture those dollars spent in order to do highly valuable things for customers.
yeah. Now, you tend to think in very large um, problem areas and solutions to that. You very famously coined the term moonshot, right? When it came to cyber, and that was even cited by a president, right? And became a guiding principle at Palo Alto Networks as well. What did you mean back then by moonshot, and where do you think we stand on that?
So that's obviously there. So many people have ripped off moonshot from
Yes,
from John F. Kennedy, right? But and applied it to many things.
yes.
But in that case, mostly it was to dream what appeared to be impossible, right?
Mm,
So that you can bring the full weight to bear of the
yeah.
nations, and private sector together. So in essence, that's what it was. So the cyber moonshot, was and continues to be an attempt, but in its incarnation, which you were very involved
Mm,
with, right? The incarnation was to say, if we were going to actually be able to protect digital society, which is this fabric,
Mm.
then it would take an all-in effort for nation states as well as the private sector and even individuals in order to do that. So how do you get
Mm.
everybody going in the same direction? Because it's going to take a long time. It's going to cost a lot,
Yeah.
not only in blood, sweat, and tears, but in
Mhm.
money, right? In order to do that. But we have to all row in the same direction. So what is the North Star that you would put out there?
Yeah.
And that was the pitch, which was adopted to a certain extent by the government, saying, "Can we make this, a national effort?"
Yeah. Oftentimes we think of cyber as something that happens in the private sector by cybersecurity companies, but you also have a strong opinion about how the public sector, law enforcement, diplomacy, right, can play a role. Can you say a few things about what you think, what the role of public policy is, right, in cyber?
Critical, not only just for critical infrastructure itself, but also from a regulatory perspective, from a national leadership perspective. Like I said, of just, sometimes only the government can define what outcomes could look like. But as we see in cyber, because we live in the digital age, consistently and constantly, we see in cyber, it kind of like moves back and forth, if you will, right? There are times where the government can lead, and there's also times where the government is going to fall short because, interestingly, unlike the
Mhm.
original moonshot,
Mhm.
the resourcing necessary to get cyber right
Yeah.
is increasingly actually in the private sector hands
Yeah.
relative to spend. This is not cyber specific, but it makes the point. When you look at what's being spent right now,
Mm.
on compute for AI, it dwarfs the moonshot,
Yes.
the literal moonshot,
The
right?
literal moonshot.
Right,
Yes.
or the Manhattan Project,
Yep.
even, right?
Yep.
So that's actually in private sector hands. So increasingly, it's obvious that private public has to work together, not only for the resourcing, but also the leadership. Where are we trying to
Yeah.
go, and then how are we going to put the guardrails on it and regulate it, and how's that going to look? AI is making that very apparent, very
Yes.
fast.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Now, um, in my intro, I said you also serve on the board of Qualcomm and Snowflake and other good companies. What is happening at the board level? Right? Is there a change in the understanding of cyber and what a board is responsible for and needs to understand? What have you seen there? Right? How has that evolved?
I'd say in the last 10 years, it went from boards being aware of cyber, obviously, because there was increasingly a large number of issues, but it was viewed as just a problem. Like, we need to solve that problem,
Mm.
as if it was could be completely solved. Then it became something that started to feel like ERM, the
Mm.
resource management.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you go to the audit committee, and
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah. A risk matrix.
yeah,
And,
there's matrix, and it's, cyber's in there, right?
right.
So it was, and then boards started to stand up standing committees.
Yeah.
I'm chair of a number of cyber committees on
Yeah.
these boards, right? So they stood those up as well.
Mhm.
So it's been a progression path. But I'll tell you the most forward-looking companies, I think, and it has to be with the CEO,
Mm.
and the CFO, but primarily the CEO and the boards have the opportunity. We used to say this all the time to our customers, which is, you don't have to solve cyber. I don't think it's a solvable thing completely. But if you just said, if I could be better at cyber,
Mm.
say, than my nearest competitor, that's a competitive advantage. So
Very much.
another way to look at it
Yeah.
is, can I be as good as I can be and better than the competition?
Yeah.
Because now cyber can be a strategic advantage for you, a
Yes.
selling
Yes.
advantage for you,
Yeah.
right? So I think some of the best CISOs that I've worked with
Yeah.
in some of these other companies understand their job not only is just protect the organization,
Mhm.
but also how do I translate that for my go-to-market folks, but specifically my CEO, and say,
Yeah.
hey, we're actually, pretty good at this and
Yes.
better than the rest. And we should let people know that, because they care so much about their data and their privacy and security these days.
Yeah. Now, a lot is said in the last few months about the role of AI. Is that playing into you would say, the advantage, right, that companies can have? Is it giving the boards of directors and executives of organizations hope or more fear?
I think it's very early. I mean, AI is moving super fast, but I think it's very early for AI in general, and then also specifically this point. So if I categorize CISOs I speak with and CS, not just on the boards I'm on, just get a chance to talk to a lot of people. And this will sound very, I know you know this already, but it'll sound very familiar because back in our early days in Palo Alto Networks, a number of them say AI, it's an application. And we've been securing applications for a long time. So we are just going to block that or allow it, right? Goes back to this, like the SaaS, and sanctioned app and unsanctioned apps and things along those lines. And so I think we're coming out of that pretty quickly, but there has been a period where people just said, this is all overblown from a security perspective. And we'll just use these tools and don't worry, we've got OpenAI covered, right? Or something like that. And he said, well, what about the other 5,000? Right? So I think that's changing very rapidly where people are really starting to understand they lack the visibility there. And then after that, they're also lacking the ability to granularly control AI to allow it. Back to conversations we had a million times with people. What you want to do is harness it and make it productive, but do it securely, right? So does your infrastructure and your systems allow you to do that? And the answer to that is not really, and it's becoming increasingly apparent.
It is increasingly becoming apparent that it's not as simple as blocking an application, right, or some kind of traffic, because there is very valid use, right, of AI, but there's also significant risk associated from a privacy and intellectual property perspective and so forth. Now, on boards, and I've had the pleasure of serving on a few, like you said, it was an enterprise risk management topic, right? It's evolved, but are there things that you can tell your peers, right, what to look out for, how to be more ready, right, to have these conversations with CISOs and with CIOs about AI and cyber? Any kind of prep, any kind of hints you can give them?
I've been saying one thing for a very long time, and it's pretty simple, but there's a lot in it, right? In order to simplify it, because a lot of boards we speak with, or even operators, right? They don't get into the depth of the level of security, nor should they need to, right? To say, how would I know how we're doing, right? And I like to use the chart you and I came up with quite some time ago, which is just say, hey, if the number of attacks are going to increase over time, and now AI has made that massive, the ability to launch an attack at a very low cost, and it's actually really sophisticated now, right? So if the number of attacks are just going to consistently rise at super fast rates, right? The question ultimately is how many of those attacks can be dealt with without a human? Because if that's your resource, then you're and that was already a problem, right? Now, AI has exacerbated a problem, but it also provides the opportunity to bring AI to the battle as well and say, well, maybe we can push that curve down even further than we used to be able to with machine learning, which was what we were all talking about before, right? And so it's so that the portion of humans, which will still be involved, right, would be something that you can handle from a resource kind of perspective. So I think that set up that paradigm was valid 10 years ago and still valid, and even more so makes the point of, are you humans fighting machines, and now we have algorithms fighting algorithms, right? And you need to lean hard into that.
From your West Point background, right, you often use the term asymmetrical warfare, right? And what you're saying is, right, you have to fight the tools that are being used by the attackers with the same tools, the same technologies, but don't forget the human.
And that's so your question you just asked me, which I didn't completely answer, was so what's the tip you give people, right?
What's the tip?
And that's what I tell people. I said, if you just ask every quarter, right? There's so many things you can ask and talk about, right? And these teams will want to talk about technical details and what's happening. And, there's a certain level that's good to know, but just ask one question every single quarter so you can track. It's like, how many attacks do we think we saw, and how many of them were humans involved with? And if that human ratio is not constant or lower the case is, then now you know where to focus, right? But if that is growing, then you probably have a team that may not even understand what the problem is, let alone what the solution is.
Yeah.
So that would be a real, it's
It
a real
is.
issue.
It
Yeah.
sure is. Speaking of that, if you were to speak with a CEO peer, a chairman peer of an organization, what would be some of the questions they should ask of their CISO to better understand where the company is at, like from a maturity perspective?
Yeah. Well, that would be the first one, the one
Yeah.
I just said, right? Yeah. I can,
Certainly.
yeah. Just show me that one
Yeah.
every single quarter. The second one we alluded to a little earlier on is, how do you view AI?
Mm.
Is
Yeah.
from a security perspective, how do you view it? If the
Yeah.
answer is it's an application or set of applications, we know how to secure applications.
Yeah.
I would be suspect
Yes.
of that answer.
Yes.
Tell me some more,
Yeah.
right, about a little more detail around that. But those would be the two main things I would be really focused on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand it. And those are questions that are sometimes really hard to answer because it's not that trivial, right, for them to understand. Let's shift to something that you've worked on for a long time, sovereignty and resilience, right? You've done that at the national level. What does NSTAC do for the US, right? And how does it apply, right, to our daily lives?
So NSTAC was set up by President Reagan, actually. So it's quite some time ago it was set up, and it was the desire was to bring the telecommunications industry, and it was analog then, right? Telecommunications industry along with the government, how to tackle large scale problems, right? Which were, how would we, how would we be able to communicate with other countries on analog, undersea cables and, standards, like how can we really move that ball forward? So it's got a long storied history that way.
Yeah.
Over time, obviously that's become entirely digital, right? Or almost all digital.
Yeah.
Turns out I tried to, when I was the chairman, to change telecommunications to something digital. It takes impossible to do, with the government, right? Impossible. It takes an act of Congress or something like that. But in any event, primarily digital these days. And but still the same mission, which was in a real public-private intersection. There are masses and masses of advisory boards and councils to the government president. Turns out there's only a handful that actually report directly to the president of the United States. And NSTAC is one of the handful that does that. So it's very closely associated with the White House, at least when I had the opportunity to be the chairman.
Yeah. What are some of the things you tackle, right, in when it comes to cyber, for example?
Well, for me, the most memorable one specifically was in my role as chair, sitting in the Situation Room with President Obama, pretty much like this. It's group. I was
How awesome!
And it was fantastic. I mean, what an opportunity, right? But I got to go to Camp David, but things like that. But in this case, it was at the time where there was a terrible shooting, and the FBI wanted to get into the iPhone, if you remember that.
Bakersfield.
Yeah, exactly. It was terrible. And there was no way to get in, apparently, right? And so President Obama came in, and after the niceties were over, and I started to, brief him, he just cut me off, and he said, so we need to get into this phone, and either you know how to get into it and you're not telling me, or you haven't thought hard enough about it yet. Like, you're too stupid, right? Like, those are your choices. There's not a third choice. It's like, okay. So, but those are the kind of things that were discussed. They could be the immediate, in the moment, sort of things, or they could be as far ranging as the moonshot, as an example. So it's a whole host of topics.
Now, resilience, right, which was certainly a big topic at NSTAC, right? It's even in its name, right? And how do you translate it to cybersecurity? What does it mean, right, from a cybersecurity perspective? And do you think that the cloud and AI have improved resilience, or have they kind of created more issues?
Well, it's all things. There's things move forward, they get two steps back and forward. So I think resilience means is not that you're bulletproof. A lot of resilience is ability to recover to where you want to be as fast as you can possibly get there. So, how nobody's immune. So how much defense can you play? Then there's only so much that's actually going to work. So when there is a problem, how fast do you know there's a problem? And if you know there's a problem, how deep does it go, before you can fix it? And then how fast can you get back to where you want to be, right? So there's a number of layers in that kind of concept of resilience. And that goes for critical infrastructure, the electric grid, all the way down to the company's data center. I think AI and cloud have modified that a lot. In some ways, it makes it faster,
Hmm.
to get back, to where you're doing and to all those steps I just went through. In other ways, it makes it even more vulnerable,
Mm.
right? So
Yeah.
as we used to talk about all the time, that the ball game really is not getting ahead of the bad guys, because I don't think we're
Mm.
going to be able to do that, because they get to use all that stuff before the good
Yeah.
guys, because we have regulations
Yeah.
and you got to figure out
Yeah.
all sorts of issues, right?
Yeah.
With that, so it's not so much like you're going to get there before they're going to get there. It's going to be mostly to say, when people are using these capabilities, how fast,
Mm.
right, can we be modifying
Yeah.
what we need to do
Yeah.
in order to keep up, right?
Yeah.
Our goal, well, one of the goals of the moonshot, but one of the
Mm.
things we used to measure constantly at Palo Alto Networks was, um, can we make it more expensive
Yes.
for an attack to become successful?
Yeah.
So in some ways you can. AI comes along
Yeah.
and all of a sudden attacks
Yeah.
get really cheap, and now we need to make it more expensive, right?
Yeah. Becomes a play of economics and opportunity. Um, so resilience is important. We also have heard more and more about sovereignty,
Right.
right? And maybe 5 years ago, we thought, oh, that's a European thing, right? GDPR.
Yeah.
But today, that's no longer the case. Right? We hear more and more about digital sovereignty. Right? Well, any any ideas there? Why is that happening? And how does that change cybersecurity?
Right. But I think you're right. When people talked about that 5 years ago, it was primarily about privacy,
Yes.
right? And it was about
Yeah.
individual privacy. It's not
Mm.
even so much data,
No.
it was
No.
about my data, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's morphed dramatically into a lot of different things now. A lot of it is still related to data, right?
Hmm.
The concept of sovereignty, even sort of the definition is, are you able to protect something? If you're talking sovereignty for a nation, be like, do I have borders? Can I protect them?
Hmm.
Right?
Yep.
So borders are gone in from a data perspective, but what actual level of control do you have over that? So today, the cutting edge of sovereignty is in AI.
Yeah.
Like, who gets to use my data to train on it?
Mm.
Right? Do I have anything to say? Do I even know what it is? Do I
Yeah.
have anything to say about it? Right? And data being, the valuable asset,
Mm.
right? Which
Mm.
everybody,
Yeah. Yeah.
knew already. Now they really know it, is super important. So for enterprises, for governments, saying, do you even know what it is? And then what kind of level of control do you have on it?
Yeah.
So that not only can you protect it, because that's how we used to think, you're
Yeah.
primarily, you still have to think about it that
Yeah.
way, but how do we use it,
Yeah.
right, to our advantage?
Yeah.
And be in control of that, right?
Yeah.
And that takes on that takes on architectural discussions, it takes on privacy discussions, it takes on nation state discussions.
Yeah.
So that's, sovereignty has a multifaceted meaning
Mm.
these days,
Mm.
but I think it really comes down to a level like control.
Control.
Yeah.
When we started Cylic, right, we had this notion that organizations do want the control back, right? Either because they never gave it away, right? There were folks that were completely air-gapped,
Right.
right? In the military, for example, critical infrastructure. There were folks who didn't want to fight with the regulators, right? At least for part of their infrastructure. Folks that, for geopolitical reasons, right, didn't want to have an architecture that was too dependent on the cloud. Right? You've worked close to those dynamics. How does it speak to you? Right? Is that something that you see improve, or do you think that geopolitical reasons become even more acute, right, as far as the architecture, right, for cyber?
Yeah, I think when it comes to sovereignty and what the impact is
Mm.
going to be on data security
Mm.
and security, there's, again, a number of layers, but at a very big picture layer, just from a geopolitical perspective, while it, while it would be great if this were wrong, it's unlikely to be wrong.
Mm.
And that would be the polarization geopolitically of the world, which continues at least on East-West. There's subdivisions
Mm.
inside of there. There's fracturing of things that we would never thought fractured,
Yeah.
impossible. NATO, right?
Yeah.
United Nations, I don't know, right? But there's a lot of polarization happening, where in that level of polarization, when in a digital age, data is critically
Mm.
important. It could be satellite data. I mean,
Mm.
it could military data, all sorts of data, critically important. And the polarization geopolitically is almost certainly going to take at least nation states, if not major enterprises, right?
Yeah.
To a level where they say, okay, we need more control over
Mm.
this, right?
Mm.
It's in our national interest to have more control over
Yeah.
this. And an aspect of cooperation, intercooperation that used to occur when it was just
Mm.
like, hey, we're just going to have complete globalization, and that's over.
Yeah.
I'm not judging that,
Nope.
I'm just
Nope.
saying it's a fact, right? So
Yes.
it's over. And the outcome of that is, as we can now see from where data is oil or whatever,
Mm.
analogy you want to use, right? Is the control over that, and absolutely governments, and then large multinational corporations, I think, are almost certainly going to have more, or try to have more control over the data. We're going to see that as far as data center builds and
Yep.
regulations. We're seeing it now. I think we're going to see more of that in the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah. So of all the things you could spend time on, right, and you have many, why did you pick Silig, right, as a group of folks, right, that you know from very well, but still, right? Why did you pick Silig as one of the things you want to work on?
Well, I'm super fortunate these days to, a little older, and be able to, spend time with folks that
Yeah.
I'd like to spend time with, and in the organizations I am involved with, they have a number of things in common, right? One is that what they're involved in is very important.
Mm.
So semiconductors, in my world,
Yep.
right? Semiconductors, data, cybersecurity are very important
Mm.
to all of society. So it gives me a ringside seat to be
Mm.
involved in all sorts of super interesting conversations with very interesting people. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is the people themselves, right? So, if you only have so much time in life, and
Yeah. Yeah.
who you spend it with
Yeah.
on important topics, that goes a long way to being, informed and happy, and, things that, you would like to do in your life. So for Silik, a very big idea for reasons we just
Mm.
talked about. I
Yep.
think a very
Yep.
big idea. And then I couldn't possibly ask for a better group of people to get to be engaged with a second time.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
privilege and an honor, and delighted to do it. But that's the common thread, at
Yeah.
least in my
Yeah.
semi-professional life these days.
Yeah.
So
Well, the honor and privilege is absolutely mutual, Mark. It's an incredible privilege to work with you again. And, you know, there are only so many things you can do in life, right? But working on something that benefits society, and hopefully that's also what Silate can do, is something that, you know, got me out of a 5-year plus retirement, and to do this again, got you involved again. It's amazing. Any final thoughts, right, for our viewers? Anything you want to give them, right, as a takeaway, right, from this conversation?
yeah, it's just probably, again, this is not trying to judge anything. It's
Mm-mm.
just an observation, right? That a lot of what, you tend to grow up with, seems to be normal
Mm.
and the way it should be and is going to be forever. And a lot of those things in our lives are changing dramatically and quickly. Geopolitically,
Mm.
socially, there's just a lot of stuff, right? And this would be an area that, when you were talking to me the first time about
Mm.
this, just seemed, it was extremely contrarian, in the sense
Yeah.
of like, well, we don't do that, right?
That's not
We
how it's
used to,
done.
right? Yeah. Yeah. But the more I, thought about it, and in the context of all
Mm.
these things changing the world, I think he's absolutely correct. That there's something very important happening here.
Mm.
And, Near's brilliant, right? So to get a chance to work with him on it is, like I said, a privilege for me.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And thank you for attending this episode of Inside Cybersecurity with Silik. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.